Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. So I'm going to talk about the Afghanistan situation, what's gone on and what's going to happen. So it's the 30th of August today, and it's tomorrow that the deadline for NATO to evacuate Kabul airport expires. So far as I know, only a few US troops are left. All the other NATO countries have previously withdrawn their troops. The last British soldiers left yesterday night. So this evacuation operation, in some regards, has been a success. About 110,000 people evacuated over roughly a fortnight. Now that's the greatest airborne evacuation in history. Look at the UK perspective. The UK has evacuated 20,000 people, about 1,000 left behind. That's still over a 95% success rate. And yes, there was that bombing by ISIS-K a few days ago, killed over 100 people, mostly Afghan refugees, 13 US Marines. So that's terrible. But the point is, it could be far, far worse. So the Taliban is actually being fairly cooperative. They could have been firing everything they had at that airport to kill the last few infidels, to kill Afghans who are pro-NATO, whom the Taliban regard as traitors. So they've been very, very restrained. Remember that the Taliban's more of a movement than an organisation, is not very disciplined. There isn't that much central control. Talib fighters don't even wear uniforms, so it's not quite clear who's in the Taliban or not. Do you swear an oath to join? Do you have an ID card? Do they even have a membership role or what? No, Afghanistan is a deeply polarised country. Well, perhaps multipolar country, because it's got about 5 major ethno-linguistic groups and several smaller ones. Obviously, about 90% of the population are Sunni, the rest are Shia. There's virtually nobody who's not a Muslim left these days. And what else? But even within, say, the Pashto-speaking people, they're divided into clans, the chieftains and so on. And so the Taliban reflects this. So you'd think that the commander of the faithful, that's the Taliban supremo, wouldn't be able to control his men. Someone would go and have a crack at NATO. Now, I know ISIS-K, as in Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Khorasan has come up. I know that it's not Iraq or Syria, but Khorasan is a province of Afghanistan where ISIS-K is particularly prominent, and they're the ones who blew up that bomb outside Kabul airport, and there were warnings of it several hours in advance. The CIA, perhaps British intelligence, knew this. It was on the media. I was reading about it here, because of how they got listening devices. They have a mole inside these organisations. What was the purpose of telling the media? Was it to scare the refugees away, who so then therefore wouldn't congregate around the airport, wouldn't be so vulnerable? Or was it so maybe ISIS-K say, the plot's been compromised, okay, scrub the operation, because it's not going to work. But they went ahead anyway. So it could have been far, far worse. There could have been far more attacks. Imagine the last few American soldiers or Marines, and if the Taliban, if they choose to close in, if they choose to fire everything, have it, you're dead. I'm guessing behind the scenes, Washington, D.C. has been saying to the Taliban, you let our people leave unmolested, because if you don't, if you fire at them, they'll be held to pay. We'll fire everything we have at you. Now, the Taliban, in some sense, is in a far stronger position than it was in the 90s, because there's been very little fighting the past 18 months. Remember, there was February 2020, was that peace deal with NATO, to say, we will not attack NATO, NATO will leave by 11th September 2021, and the Taliban has largely been as good as its word. They've attacked the Afghan army, not even that much in that time. Is just vanished like the dew in the morn, the Afghan army. So the infrastructure is actually in fairly good shape. They're not inheriting a pile of rubble as they did in the 90s, because there was such heavy fighting. And, Kabul is a quite developed city. It's got 4 million people, bigger than ever, skyscrapers and so on. So they don't want the country to be absolutely trashed, and all their neighbours are willing to at least tolerate them. Pakistan is genuinely elated that the Taliban, their boys, have won. And even the Iranians would be willing to get along with them, so long as the Hazaras are left unmolested. That's the Shia minority. Turkmenistan is run by a viciously cruel tyrant with his demented cult of the personality. Turkmenistan borders Afghanistan. There's some ethnic Turkmens who are Afghan citizens. And some of the Turkmens are attracted to the Taliban ideology. Plus, their government is so horrifically cruel, they might think the Taliban's not quite so bad by comparison. The same is true of Uzbekistan, though to a lesser extent. But Turkmenistan, ironically, is the one that's got the best relationship with the Taliban of any Central Asian country, because Turkmenistan's foreign policy is non-interference and neutrality. They're not a member of any international body besides, say the UN. And Kyrgyzstan, well, doesn't border them, sorry, come on to Tajikistan, which does. And the Tajik language is almost the same as Dari or Persian, Dari being the major language of Afghanistan. But Tajikistan has previous, because in 1992 they were invaded by the Taliban, and there was a very bloody 5-year civil war. And it was only with massive military intervention by other countries in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russia and Kazakhstan, that the Tajik government was able to defeat the Taliban. And President Emomali Rahmon, who remains in charge of Tajikistan to this day, he's 68, he's obese, he's infirm, he may well drop dead at any moment and hand on to his son. His country's got only 5 million people. It's the poorest country in the former Soviet Union. His army's only got 9,000 soldiers. It'd be the Taliban for the taking. The Taliban's been estimated to have anything up to 300,000 soldiers. So why did the Afghan army just vanish, just drop its arms or flee to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan? Well, they knew NATO support was being withdrawn. I suppose they saw which way things were going to go. And, once one commander surrenders or flees, the others are more likely to do it, is a sort of a snowball effect, strengthen the Taliban, who then get all these weapons. And the Taliban, they've got themselves hundreds of NATO-supplied armoured personnel carriers, jeeps, Humvees, tanks, helicopters, and so on, even a few fixed-wing aircraft, artillery pieces. So they're armed to the teeth. As I say, they're in a much mightier position than they were in the 90s. And very few Afghans are minded to fight them. They say that's a lost cause. A few Afghan National Army remnants are hanging out in the supposedly impregnable Panjshir Valley, a bit northeast of Kabul, where Ahmad Shah Massoud, where he resisted the Soviets for several years in the 1980s. So the Taliban have moderated, so it appears, which would be a gain from the NATO mission. So there has been some furtherance of human rights, but we'll see at the moment. Maybe they'll revert to type the Taliban. My suspicion is that they actually want international recognition. They won't be as barbaric as they were before. I'm not saying they're going to win any prizes from Amnesty International or any feminist organisations, but I don't think they're going to be as medieval as they were before. Realise why they were unpopular. So that some, education of women is going on. They have to wear the hijab. Ban some sorts of entertainment, probably not all sorts of entertainment. And they would quite like international aid. 40% of Afghanistan's budget is made up of aid. They realised why they're so hated last time. So the Afghan National Army fell partly because there's not such a strong national identity. People will identify with their ethno-linguistic group, or their region, with their clan. What else? Because of peculation. NATO's mistake was to disperse the funds to the Afghan government and the army, which so often wasn't paid to the soldiers. Sometimes, you have a company of 100 soldiers, only 80 of them are really there. The others are just names on the list, and some officer is filtering the money, or the other soldiers, they don't get their full salary or don't get it at all, so they weren't paid. Money wasn't spent on what it should be paid. Corruption is just a way of life. And the United States government knew from very early on that Hamid Karzai, the previous president, his brother was one of the biggest heroin dealers in Afghanistan, and that's the only high-earning export. So I had to turn Nelson's eye to this, and obviously the Taliban was making money out of heroin as well. So Afghanistan had some semblance of democracy in the 70s, bearing in mind that literacy was very low, and the idea of even elections and voting was a very new thing back then. But it was a somewhat functional democracy for a while. How popular is the Taliban? We don't know, because they weren't allowed to participate in elections. If we're lucky, they will have reconciliation. They will have some former elements of the previous government serving in coalition with them. That's the idea. So that's it. I don't see anybody going back into Afghanistan. But in the 1980s, the Mujahideen, that's the umbrella term for all those resistance groups which had defeated the Soviets. When it came to 1989 and the Soviets withdrew, the Mujahideen broke up into those separate factions, who then started knocking seven bells out of each other again. So the Taliban's quite vociferous, and it might split up again. Some of them make common cause with the former Afghan government. We shall see. Now that they're deprived of a common enemy, there's not so much something to unite against anymore. But anyway, I don't think it'll be that bad. Perhaps this is foolishly misplaced optimism. But it's dispiriting that NATO, after 20 years and $2 trillion, couldn't leave behind a viable government. Remember, Kabul fell 4 weeks before NATO was supposed to withdraw. I don't know where this 31st of August deadline came from, because remember, it was 11th of September was the deadline for NATO to pull out. So I don't think it'll be as horrendous as it was before. Perhaps this is just mindless optimism on my part, and my good faith is misplaced. The Taliban are not exactly trustworthy, I'll say that, but there's some self-interest would mean that they would behave reasonably well. But the US has rid itself of a problem, has got more money. In the fullness of time, I think people will recognise it's the right decision by Joe Biden. He actually is implementing Trump's agreement. Not to do so would be to restart the conflict, and then the United States could be mired there for much longer. How would you get out whilst, if there was no ceasefire, the Taliban shooting at you as you're taking off? So I think it was the right thing to do, because obviously NATO just didn't have the will to fight, had the stomach to fight. Could have fully committed and won the war several years ago, but that would require more pressure on Pakistan. Sanctions, obviously no aid. Aid should have been cut off much longer ago. Trying to get India involved, something like that. And they weren't willing to go the full hog, go the whole hog rather, NATO, because they think that could lead to a Taliban-inspired coup d'etat in Pakistan, because quite a few army officers and ISI officers are genuinely sympathetic to the Taliban ideology in Pakistan, and then you have the Taliban with a nuclear weapon to their name. So problems in the Afghan army, as I say, that's led to NATO defeat. Not highly motivated, sometimes poorly led. I don't want to castigate them all. I mean, I'm no soldier, but this is what I've heard. Yeah, some of them superb, a few of them middling, but quite a few of them bad, poorly motivated. Some of them close to the Taliban's worldview, and even double agents, even tipping off the Taliban. So it was very problematic. But I thought that these thousands of people who've come to the United Kingdom, the British Army is going to hire some of them apparently, which I think is a good idea actually, that those are decent soldiers. So that's it. I shan't be booking any holidays to Afghanistan anytime soon. Toodaloo.